Imagine waking up tomorrow to a world where winter isn't just a hay season. It is the greatest predator you've ever faced. There is no thermostat humming quietly in the background, no thick jacket hanging by the door, no supermarket stocked with food, no hot coffee waiting in your kitchen, and no weather forecast warning you that temperatures will drop overnight. Every breath burns your lungs. The wind slices through your skin with frightening precision. Snow stretches to every horizon, and somewhere beyond the white silence, something much larger than you is already searching for its next meal. Now imagine that this isn't an emergency. This is simply life. For hundreds of thousands of years, this was the reality faced by our ancestors. Long before cities, agriculture, or even written language, humans survived winters that would challenge many modern people equipped with insulated clothing, central heating, and advanced technology. They endured landscapes filled with mammoths, cave lions, woolly rhinoceroses, and endless months of freezing darkness. Yet somehow, generation after generation, they lived long, enough to raise children, share knowledge, and leave behind the descendants who would eventually become us. How? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Fire, warm clothes, caves. But the deeper archaeologists dig, the more surprising the story becomes. Archaeological evidence suggests that surviving the Ice Age was never about a single invention. It was about combining hundreds of small decisions into an extraordinary system of survival. Every campfire had to be maintained. Every shelter had to be planned. Every hunt carried enormous risks. Every piece of clothing represented countless hours of craftsmanship. Even a simple mistake, losing a fire during a blizzard or misjudging the migration of a herd, could mean the difference between an entire community surviving the winter or disappearing forever. Current research indicates that the greatest survival tool our ancestors possessed wasn't hidden in their hands. It was hidden inside their minds. They imagined the future before it arrived. They stored knowledge in stories. They cooperated with people who weren't immediate family. They transformed memory into strategy and fear into preparation. Over the next few minutes, we're going to step into their frozen world, not as distant observers reading about history, but as fellow travelers trying to survive one impossible winter. Along the way, we'll discover why fire became much more than warmth, how mammoth bones turned into architecture, why grandparents could be as valuable as the strongest hunters, and why the psychological battle against winter may have been just as important as the physical one. Because this isn't only the story of how ancient humans survived brutal winters. It's the story of how winter helped create the kind of minds that still shape the way we think, plan, cooperate, and survive today. If someone asked you to name the greatest invention in human history, you might say the wheel, agriculture, electricity, or perhaps the internet. But if you had stood on the frozen plains of Ice Age Europe 40,000 years ago and asked the very same question, there would have been only one possible answer: fire. Not because it was convenient, because without it, almost everything else became impossible. Scientists believe humans had already mastered the controlled use of fire hundreds of thousands of years before the harshest Ice Age winters arrived. By then, fire was no longer a remarkable discovery. It had become something far more valuable. Technology so deeply woven into daily life that an entire community's survival depended on it. Yet when we imagine prehistoric campfires, we often underestimate what they truly represented. We picture people sitting around glowing flames simply trying to stay warm. In reality, warmth was only one of dozens of jobs that fire performed every single day. Current research indicates that cooking dramatically increased the amount of energy humans could extract from food. Raw meat requires enormous digestive effort, but heat breaks down connective tissue, softens plant fibers, and makes nutrients far easier to absorb. In other words, every meal cooked over a fire produced more usable energy than the exact same meal eaten raw. Evolutionary biologists have even argued that this simple change helped reshape the human body itself. As food became easier to digest, less energy was devoted to maintaining a massive digestive system, allowing more resources to support the growth of an increasingly complex brain. One possible explanation is that every meal prepared beside a prehistoric fire quietly fueled the evolution of human intelligence. But the fire's influence stretched far beyond biology. When darkness covered the Ice Age landscape for 16 hours each day, fire created an island of safety in an otherwise terrifying world. Beyond the circle of light-weighted cave lions, wolves, hyenas, and bears, predators, perfectly adapted to hunting in darkness. Most of them instinctively avoided open flames, turning every campfire into an invisible wall, separating humans from the wilderness. Imagine lying down to sleep while hearing distant growls echo through the frozen night. You have no locked doors, no concrete walls, and no emergency services to call. Between your family and the darkness stands only a pile of burning wood that someone must keep alive until sunrise. That responsibility was never taken lightly. Anthropologists propose that maintaining the communal fire may have been one of the most important roles in an ice age. Community. The strongest hunter could miss a mammoth. A skilled toolmaker could eventually craft another spear. But if the fire died during a blizzard and nobody knew how to bring it back, the consequences could become catastrophic within hours. Fire also transformed nearly every other aspect of survival. It hardened wooden spear tips before hunting. It dried soaked animal hides after heavy snow. It illuminated caves where tools were repaired and children learned from elders. Around its flames, stories became lessons, memories became traditions, and knowledge traveled safely from one generation to the next. Perhaps the greatest achievement of fire was that it gave humans something no other predator possessed: time. Instead of spending every waking moment reacting to danger, people could gather after sunset to think, teach, plan, and imagine tomorrow. The fire didn't merely keep bodies alive through winter. It gave the human mind a place to grow, and once people learned how to master fire, they faced another challenge. That was just as difficult. Staying warm outside was one thing. Creating a place that could truly become home in the middle of an ice age was something else entirely. If you found a cave in the middle of an ice age winter, you might think your problems were over. A solid roof, thick stone walls, protection from snow and wind. Compared to the open tundra, it must have felt like finding a luxury hotel, but ancient humans quickly discovered that a cave was only the beginning of survival, not the destination. Archaeological evidence suggests that deep caves maintain surprisingly stable temperatures throughout the year, often hovering between 10 and 13 degrees Celsius regardless of the freezing conditions outside. That might sound cold by modern standards, but compared to sub-zero winds sweeping across open plains, it was the difference between discomfort and death. Even so, caves were never naturally comfortable. The air was damp. Smoke accumulated if fires were poorly positioned. Water dripped constantly from ceilings. Darkness swallowed every corner beyond the reach of firelight. Predators had often used these shelters long before humans arrived, meaning every cave had to be inspected, defended, and gradually transformed into a place suitable for living. Scientists believe this transformation marked one of humanity's earliest architectural revolutions. Excavations across Europe reveal that prehistoric caves were carefully organized rather than randomly occupied. Hearths were positioned where heat could spread efficiently throughout the chamber. Sleeping areas were separated from spaces used for butchering animals or making stone tools. Storage zones kept valuable resources dry and accessible. Waste was often discarded away from living areas, reducing disease and making daily life more manageable. None of this happened by accident. It required planning. It required communication. Most importantly, it required people to imagine how a space could function before they began changing it. This ability may seem ordinary today. Every modern house has rooms with different purposes. Kitchens are separated from bedrooms. Storage spaces exist for future needs rather than immediate ones. Yet somewhere in the frozen landscapes of prehistory, human beings first began organizing space according to ideas instead of instinct. That change was profoundly important. Other animals seek shelter. Humans redesign it, but caves created another problem. You cannot move a cave Current research indicates that Ice Age hunter-gatherers constantly followed migrating, herds across enormous distances. Reindeer, bison, horses, and mammoths rarely remained in one location throughout the year. If people wanted food, they had to move with them. Sooner or later, every group reached a place where no cave existed. The cold remained. The wind remained. The predators remained. Only the shelter was missing. For most animals, that would have meant retreat. For humans, it became an engineering challenge. Across parts of modern-day Ukraine, Russia, and Central Europe, archaeologists have uncovered something almost unbelievable. Entire houses constructed primarily from mammoth bones. At first glance, the idea sounds almost mythical. How could bones become walls? How could enormous curved tusks support a roof? Yet excavation after excavation tells the same remarkable story. Builders selected massive leg bones as structural supports. Curved tusks acted like natural beams. Shoulder blades filled gaps between larger pieces. Everything was carefully arranged into circular frameworks before being covered with thick animal hides that blocked wind and trapped precious warmth inside. This wasn't improvisation. It was architecture. Every bone had a purpose. Every piece had to fit. Every mistake weakened the structure. Anthropologists proposed that constructing one of these homes required extraordinary cooperation. Hundreds of heavy bones had to be transported, sorted, lifted, and assembled without cranes, metal tools, or written instructions. No single individual could possibly complete such a project alone. In many ways, these mammoth bone houses reveal something even more fascinating than human strength. They reveal human imagination. A mammoth was no longer simply food. Its bones became walls. Its tusks became roof beams. Its hide became insulation. Its tendons became rope. Its fat became fuel. Its body continued protecting human life long after the animal itself was gone. Perhaps this is one of the earliest examples of a uniquely human habit, the ability to look at the same object and see not only what it is, but what it could become. And once humans learned to build homes from the remains of giants, another realization slowly emerged. The strongest shelter in the world meant very little if the people living inside it couldn't survive together. Imagine two groups of ancient humans facing exactly the same winter. They have the same stone tools, the same clothing, the same shelters, the same access to game animals. Yet by the time spring arrives, one group is still alive. The other has vanished. What made the difference? It probably wasn't strength, it wasn't speed, and it certainly wasn't luck alone. Anthropologists propose that the greatest survival advantage our species ever evolved wasn't hidden in stronger muscles or sharper senses. It was hidden in something far less visible: cooperation. Modern culture often celebrates the image of the lone survivor, the individual who overcomes impossible odds through determination and personal skill. We admire stories about explorers stranded in the wilderness or television survival experts enduring nature alone. But Ice Age archaeology tells an entirely different story. No one survived alone. In fact, trying to survive alone may have been one of the fastest ways to die. Scientists believe that hunter-gatherer communities usually lived in bands of roughly 20 to 50 individuals. At first, that number might seem surprisingly small, yet it was large enough to include something incredibly valuable: a wide range of specialists. One person remembered migration routes. Another understood medicinal plants. Someone else knew how to shape stone into razor-sharp blades. Others became exceptional hunters, hide processors, tool makers, storytellers, or firekeepers. No single human mastered everything. Instead, knowledge itself became divided among the community. Imagine losing the group's best hunter. It would be tragic. But imagine losing the only elder who remembered where reindeer gathered during exceptionally harsh winters, or the woman who knew which roots remained edible beneath frozen soil after heavy snowfall, or the craftsman capable of repairing broken bone needles needed to produce winter clothing. Suddenly, the death of one individual threatened the survival of everyone else. Current research indicates that ancient communities were, in many ways, living libraries. Every person carried information that existed nowhere else. Long before books, every elder represented decades of accumulated experience. Every parent carried practical lessons learned from countless mistakes. Every successful hunt added another chapter to humanity's growing encyclopedia of survival. This may explain why humans invested so heavily in teaching. Around the evening fire, stories served purposes far greater than entertainment. A tale about a hunter attacked by a cave bear taught children where danger waited. A legend describing an unusually cold winter reminded future generations to gather extra food before the first snowfall. Even myths may have preserved practical survival knowledge hidden beneath memorable narratives. Cognitive scientists believe that stories are remarkably efficient memory systems. Facts disappear quickly. Stories remain. Our ancestors understood this thousands of years before neuroscience existed. When a child listened to an elder describe a disastrous winter decades earlier, they weren't simply hearing history. They were rehearsing the future. Perhaps this explains another unusual feature of human evolution. Unlike many mammals, humans remain dependent on adults for an extraordinarily long time. A newborn foal can stand within hours. A young deer quickly learns to run. Human children require years before they can survive independently. At first glance, this seems like a weakness. Evolution usually favors independence. So why did our species become so helpless? One possible explanation is that our greatest adaptation wasn't physical at all. It was cultural. Human children weren't simply growing larger. They were downloading an enormous amount of information accumulated across hundreds of generations. Every skill, from making fire to recognizing animal tracks, sewing, clothing, finding water, reading weather patterns, identifying poisonous plants, and understanding social relationships, had to be learned. Growing up as a human meant inheriting one of the most sophisticated survival manuals ever created, not written on paper, written inside other human minds. And all of that knowledge depended on something that burned calories, just as relentlessly as the freezing wind outside. The human brain itself, which raises another fascinating question. If surviving winter demanded enormous amounts of energy, where did all those calories actually come from? Imagine someone offered you two meals. The first is a mountain of lean meat. The second is a much smaller portion covered in thick layers of fat. Most modern people would probably choose the lean meat. We've spent decades being told to avoid fat whenever possible. But if you had lived during the Ice Age, making that choice could have cost you your life. Current research indicates that surviving extreme cold dramatically increases the body's energy demands. Even while sitting still, your body continuously burns calories simply to maintain its core temperature. Every breath of freezing air steals heat. Every gust of wind forces your metabolism to work harder. Every hour spent gathering wood, tracking animals, or walking through deep snow multiplies those demands even further. Winter wasn't slowly draining your energy. It was consuming it. Scientists estimate that prolonged exposure to severe cold can increase a person's metabolic requirements by 50% or more for ancient humans already living without reliable food supplies that created an unforgiving mathematical equation. Fail to replace enough calories, and your body would begin shutting itself down. At first, the symptoms seemed almost harmless. You felt tired. Your fingers became clumsy. Thinking required more effort. Then your speech slowed. Your judgment deteriorated. Eventually, the body sacrificed heat to protect its vital organs, and hypothermia quietly took over. Ironically, many victims even stopped feeling cold. Their brains became too exhausted to recognize the danger. Ancient humans had no understanding of metabolism, body chemistry, or calories. Yet archaeological evidence suggests they understood something equally important through experience. Fat meant survival. Every successful hunt was evaluated differently from the way we might judge it today. The largest animal wasn't always the best prize because it produced the most meat. It was valuable because it carried enormous reserves of energy. A mature woolly mammoth could weigh several tons. Beneath its thick hide rested vast deposits of insulating fat that had evolved to help the animal survive the same brutal winters humans faced. One possible explanation is that ancient hunters valued these fat reserves even more than the meat itself. Fat could be eaten immediately, It could be rendered into concentrated energy stores. It could fuel fires. It could waterproof leather. It even became an essential ingredient in preserving food for future months. Nothing was wasted. Every part of the animal represented another chance to survive until spring. This way of thinking feels surprisingly unfamiliar today. Modern supermarkets encourage abundance. Ice Age life demanded efficiency. People weren't simply asking, "Can we eat this?" They were asking, "How many days of life does this provide?" That single difference changed everything. Anthropologists propose that prehistoric hunters viewed animals less as isolated meals and more as complete survival systems. Bones became tools and building materials. Tendons became thread and rope. Hides became clothing and shelter. Fat became stored warmth. Even stomachs and bladders became natural containers for carrying water or preserving rendered grease. An animal's death continued protecting human life long after the hunt had ended. Perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in the extraordinary planning that followed a successful mammoth hunt. Imagine bringing home nearly 500,000 calories at once. It sounds like unimaginable wealth, but it also creates a completely different problem. Without refrigerators, without freezers, without electricity, how do you stop thousands of kilograms of food from disappearing before winter is over? The answer reveals that Ice Age humans weren't merely excellent hunters. They were remarkable planners. Imagine spending several exhausting days helping your community hunt a mammoth. Against impossible odds, you succeed. Thousands of kilograms of meat now lie before you. For a brief moment, everyone celebrates. Then a new realization appears. The hunt is over. The real challenge has just begun. Food has always had an invisible enemy: time. Fresh meat spoils quickly. Predators smell blood from astonishing distances. Bacteria begin breaking down tissue almost immediately. In the modern world, refrigeration solves this problem so completely that we rarely think about it. Ice Age humans couldn't afford that luxury. They had to invent one. Archaeological evidence suggests that prehistoric communities developed remarkably sophisticated methods of preserving food long before agriculture ever appeared. They understood that surviving winter wasn't determined solely by how much food they could obtain. It depended on how much they could still eat months later. This required a completely different way of thinking. A successful hunter wasn't simply someone who brought home today's dinner. Success meant feeding people who hadn't even become hungry yet. That idea may sound obvious to us, but psychologically, it represents one of humanity's greatest evolutionary achievements. Most animals consume resources as they find them. Humans learn to imagine needs that did not yet exist. Scientists believe this ability to mentally travel into the future became one of our defining characteristics. One possible explanation is that every preserved meal represented an act of imagination. People weren't preserving food for themselves in the present. They were preserving it for a future version of themselves they could only imagine. That future thinking changed human history. Current research indicates that vast regions of Ice Age Eurasia were covered by permafrost, ground that remained permanently frozen throughout the year. Ancient communities recognized something extraordinary about this landscape. The earth itself could become a freezer. Instead of fighting the frozen ground, they used it. Large storage pits were dug into permanently frozen soil, creating natural cold chambers capable of preserving enormous quantities of meat for weeks or even months. Unlike temporary snowbanks, the deep layers of permafrost maintained stable temperatures that dramatically slowed decomposition. Nature had already built the refrigerator. Humans simply learned how to use it. Not every environment offered permanent frozen ground, however, so people developed another strategy: drying. Thin strips of meat were carefully cut and suspended above slow burning fires or exposed to cold, dry winter air. As moisture gradually disappeared, bacteria lost the water they needed to multiply. What remained was lighter, more durable, and capable of lasting far beyond fresh meat. Fat received equally careful treatment. Rather than allowing precious energy to go to waste, it was slowly rendered over controlled fires until it became a concentrated liquid. Once cooled, it hardened into dense blocks that could be stored inside clean stomachs, bladders, or carefully prepared skin containers. Every calorie was accounted for. Nothing valuable disappeared without purpose. Anthropologists propose that prehistoric people may even have produced something surprisingly familiar to modern survival experts. A mixture of dried meat ground into powder, blended with rendered fat, and sometimes combined with dried berries. Today, we know a similar food as pemmican. Compact, extremely calorie-dense, easy to transport, capable of lasting for months. In many ways, it was the Ice Age equivalent of a modern emergency, ration. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery isn't what these people stored. It's when they stored it. Autumn was not a season of relaxation. It was a race against an invisible deadline. Every hunting expedition became more urgent. Every hide had to be processed before freezing temperatures intensified. Every piece of firewood gathered represented another night of survival. Entire communities worked with one shared understanding. Winter was coming, whether they were ready or not. Scientists argue that this reveals something profoundly human. Preparation is an act of optimism. No one spends weeks preserving food unless they believe they will still be alive to eat it. Every filled storage pit was more than a collection of calories. It was a declaration of faith in tomorrow. And yet, no matter how carefully food was preserved, one difficult truth remained. Sometimes, the smartest way to survive winter wasn't staying where you were at all. Sometimes, the only way to survive was to keep moving. Modern maps make the world feel permanent. Mountains stay where they are. Rivers rarely change course. Cities appear fixed, connected by roads that never seem to move. It's easy to imagine that ancient humans lived in the same kind of stable landscape. They didn't. The Ice Age was a world in constant motion. Every season transformed the environment. Rivers froze and thawed. Herds of animals traveled hundreds of kilometers. Grasslands expanded, then disappeared beneath snow. Entire ecosystems shifted with the changing climate. If humans wanted to survive, they couldn't expect the world to adapt to them. They had to adapt to the world. Current research indicates that many prehistoric communities practiced seasonal migration rather than remaining in one settlement throughout the year. This wasn't random wandering. It was an incredibly organized strategy built upon generations of observation. Imagine trying to plan a journey hundreds of kilometers long. You have no compass, no written maps, no road signs, no satellite navigation. Everything depends on memory, not your own memory alone. The memory of your parents, your grandparents, their grandparents before them. Every successful migration represented centuries of accumulated knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Scientists believe that large grazing animals such as reindeer, bison, wild horses, and mammoths followed predictable seasonal routes in search of fresh vegetation. Human communities learned those patterns with astonishing precision. They didn't simply chase animals, they anticipated them. That distinction reveals something extraordinary. A wolf follows prey it can see. Humans followed prey they expected to see weeks or even months later. One possible explanation is that this ability to predict future movement transformed hunting into an exercise in long-term planning rather than immediate reaction. Instead of asking, "Where are the animals today?" people asked, "Where will they be when winter arrives?" That single shift in thinking may have changed the course of our evolution. Archaeological evidence suggests that Upper Paleolithic communities often spent warmer months in open hunting territories before gradually moving toward sheltered river valleys as temperatures declined. River valleys offered several crucial advantages. Steep slopes blocked freezing winds. Fresh water remained available even when surrounding landscapes froze solid. Animals naturally gathered there in search of food and protection. By following the valleys, humans weren't merely escaping winter. They were positioning themselves exactly where survival became most likely. Even more remarkable is the evidence hidden inside prehistoric stone tools. Scientists have discovered stone materials transported hundreds of kilometers from their geological origins. Certain types of flint found at archaeological sites simply do not exist nearby. Someone carried them, not by accident, on purpose. This tells us something profound. Ancient humans weren't wandering across unfamiliar wilderness. They were traveling through landscapes they already understood. Every mountain pass, every river crossing, every sheltered campsite, every dangerous predator territory. These places existed not only in the physical world but also inside human memory. In many ways, these invisible mental maps were as valuable as food itself. Lose your supplies, and you might recover. Lose your knowledge of the landscape, and the wilderness suddenly becomes infinite. Cognitive scientists believe the human brain evolved an extraordinary capacity for spatial memory precisely because survival demanded it. Entire landscapes became living databases filled with remembered landmarks, seasonal clues, and countless experiences accumulated across lifetimes. Perhaps this is why exploration has always fascinated our species. Long before anyone crossed oceans or climbed the highest mountains, our ancestors had already become masters of navigating uncertainty. But no matter how perfectly they planned their journeys, no matter how carefully they stored food, no matter how well they understood the land, every survival strategy ultimately depended on one remarkable organ, weighing little more than a kilogram: the human brain. And that may have been humanity's greatest adaptation of all. If you ask someone what allowed ancient humans to survive the Ice Age, most answers would sound familiar: fire, shelters, warm clothing, powerful hunting weapons. All of them are correct, but they all share one hidden origin. None of them could exist without the same extraordinary ability: the ability to imagine a future that had not happened yet. Imagine standing beside a fire in late autumn. The air is cold, but winter has not fully arrived. Food is still available. The rivers still flow. Nothing around you suggests immediate danger. An animal would respond only to what exists in that moment. A human does something entirely different. They begin preparing for a disaster that hasn't happened. Scientists believe this capacity for mental simulation is one of the defining characteristics of our species. Rather than reacting only to immediate threats, humans learn to create detailed models of possible futures inside their minds. What if the herd never returns? What if the river freezes earlier this year? What if the snow becomes deeper than last winter? What if someone gets injured during the hunt? Every one of these questions exists before reality provides an answer. That ability changed everything. Current research indicates that the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for planning, decision-making, and long-term thinking, is far more developed in humans than in any other living species. This allowed our ancestors to coordinate complex activities, involving dozens of individuals over extended periods of time, building shelters, organizing mammoth hunts, preparing food months in advance, teaching children, maintaining alliances between neighboring groups. None of these tasks could succeed without imagining events that had not yet occurred. Perhaps nowhere is this mental ability more visible than in Ice Age cave paintings. When most people think about famous sites like Lascaux or Chauvet, they imagine prehistoric art galleries, beautiful drawings left behind by early humans. But what if we are looking at them the wrong way? Anthropologists propose that many cave paintings may have served practical purposes alongside their artistic and spiritual significance. Animals are often depicted with astonishing anatomical accuracy: muscle structure, body proportions, movement, seasonal behavior. These weren't casual sketches, they were observations. Some researchers suggest that cave walls may have functioned as visual memory systems, allowing important knowledge to survive long after the people who first discovered it had died. Imagine a young hunter standing beside an elder deep inside a cave. The elder points toward the painted outline of a bison, not simply to admire the artwork, but to explain where the animal usually turns when frightened, which muscles reveal exhaustion, how the herd behaves when calves are nearby. The wall becomes a classroom. The painting becomes a lesson. The lesson becomes another generation's chance to survive. Knowledge no longer depended entirely on memory. It could now be reinforced through images. That was a revolutionary idea. Scientists also believe that language dramatically amplified this process. Words allowed people to describe places they had never seen, warn others about predators they had never encountered, explain hunting strategies before the hunt even began. For the first time, experience could travel independently of direct observation. One person's mistake became everyone else's education. One successful innovation spread through entire communities. Culture itself became humanity's greatest survival technology. And once knowledge could survive longer than the individual who discovered it, something extraordinary happened. Human evolution was no longer driven only by biology. It became driven by ideas, which leads to one final question. If intelligence, cooperation, and imagination allowed humans to survive, one of the harshest climates Earth has ever produced, What does that reveal about the species we have become today? Imagine taking one of those Ice Age survivors and bringing them into the modern world. You hand them a thick winter jacket. You show them central heating, electric lights, supermarkets filled with more food than an entire prehistoric community could consume in months, cars that cross distances requiring weeks of walking, hospitals capable of treating injuries that would once have been fatal. From their perspective, it would look like magic. Yet after the amazement faded, they might notice something surprisingly familiar: the people. Because despite everything we've built, we are still carrying the same mind that crossed the frozen plains tens of thousands of years ago. Scientists believe the human brain has changed remarkably little since the late Ice Age. The world around us has transformed beyond recognition, but the cognitive machinery inside our heads remains largely the same. We still gather around light when darkness falls. The fire has become a television, a laptop, a smartphone screen. But the instinct is unchanged. We still tell stories to teach our children. Only now those stories travel through books, films, classrooms, podcasts, and YouTube instead of crackling campfires beneath a sky filled with stars. We still prepare for uncertain futures. Our food may come from supermarkets instead of mammoth hunts, yet we continue saving money, buying insurance, storing emergency supplies, checking weather forecasts, and making plans years in advance. Current research indicates that these behaviors are not modern inventions. They are ancient survival instincts expressed in a modern environment. Perhaps the greatest misconception about prehistoric humans is believing they were fundamentally different from us. They weren't. They laughed. They worried. They loved their children. They mourned those they lost. They argued. They solved problems together. They imagined better tomorrows. The distance between their world and ours is measured less by intelligence than by technology. The same curiosity that once asked, "How do we survive this winter?" eventually became the curiosity that asked, "What lies beyond the ocean?" The same imagination that transformed mammoth bones into houses later, transformed stone into cities, wood into ships, steam into engines, silicon into computers, and ideas into civilizations. Every invention began inside the same remarkable brain. Anthropologists often describe humanity as a species uniquely adapted, through culture rather than biology. Instead of evolving sharper claws, we invented tools. Instead of growing thicker fur, we learned to sew clothing. Instead of becoming physically stronger than predators, we became better at thinking together. Perhaps that has always been our greatest strength. Not that we conquered nature, but that we learned from it. Winter was never simply an obstacle our ancestors endured. It was one of history's greatest teachers. Every freezing night demanded another solution. Every failed strategy became another lesson. Every successful generation passed a little more knowledge to the next, till survival itself became humanity's greatest inheritance. In many ways, you are holding that inheritance right now. Every decision you make, every problem you solve, every plan you create for tomorrow, every story you remember, every person you teach, they are all echoes of a journey that began hundreds of thousands of years ago beside a small fire in the middle of an unimaginably cold world. The snow eventually melted, the glaciers retreated, the mammoths disappeared, but the mind that learned to survive them never did. And perhaps that is the greatest survival story our species has ever written. If you enjoyed exploring how ancient humans survived some of the harshest winters our planet has ever seen, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Which survival strategy impressed you the most? Was it the mastery of fire, the incredible mammoth bone houses, the power of cooperation, or the extraordinary ability to plan for a future that hadn't happened yet? I'd genuinely love to hear your answer. And if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of human evolution, archaeology, and the science behind how our ancestors shaped the modern world, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more journeys into humanity's distant past. Next time, we'll explore another question that has fascinated scientists for decades: how ancient humans turned wolves into dogs. It's the remarkable story of how one of the most dangerous predators on Earth gradually became humanity's closest companion, and how that partnership changed the course of civilization forever. Until then, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next journey through human history.